How did Nkrumah view the British colonial rule in the first place?
Okay, so first off, like he didn't even really agree with the idea sort of like of a monarchy or a republic and like these sort of like sort of horizontal forms of leadership that like colonialism and like Western ideals were very fond of at the time. So a lot of his work sort of talks about how he had this idea that we discussed in class of like the go to the people model, and sort of like leadership shouldn't have like its own, it shouldn't have formed into like a separate class of like ruling elites who were sort of born into the system, but it should more be people who were in like community with and understanding of like what the masses really needed and wanted from like government and their systems. And so like a lot of this also has to do with the idea that he really was not okay with the sort of like British and colonial system of individualism, and how that sort of has like transferred over into, I guess, like African consciousness as well. But like essentially that would have just been the idea that like they sort of were more about like the less about the common good and more about like the good for like certain people or people who had enough rights to sort of like game the system. So a lot of what we see colonial rule trying to do when like freedom does become something that like Ghana in particular is like about to like achieve is basically they're trying to like separate and like pit like oppositional parties against each other. So sort of this idea that like everyone's for themselves or like everyone's for like the party that they align with more than everyone being for like all their countrymen. And so I think he definitely sees that as something that's like a product of colonialism and like British influence in the country, and something that he believes that like to achieve true unity like Africa has to resist. So yeah.
So Ghana is one of the first African countries to achieve unity. So how does the British government affect? How did the British government affect the process of African unity?
Yeah, so a lot of it had to do with the way that like unity as a state relies on not being tied economically to other. Sorry, how like unity as a state has to mean that other countries aren't like financially and economically dependent on like other Western states. So a lot of the way that the British government sort of hindered that process of unity was by leaving the countries in poverty. And so because like the natural resources were depleted and there wasn't like an educational system in place to sort of push for like industrialization, you found this system where a lot of African countries were like very much like trying to achieve unity, but they didn't have like the wherewithal to like make their own constitution and like set in place their own systems of power. So then British government was able to like come in like 3 years later and say like, oh, we're going to change the constitution to like benefit our interests. So like they were able to like leverage this idea of freedom by being like, oh, if you do that, well, we won't help you like implement this system and like your own government. So I think a lot of it had to do with them sort of the British government trying to say like, we're going to take a hands-off approach while not giving people and having like stripped African countries of the resources to really like run self-sufficiently.
How did the British influence the type of rule that the people of Ghana chose after the freedom?
Great. So I think a lot of that had to do again with this idea of like individualism, and because of their direct hand and pitting the opposition against each other and deciding like who would have seats in like their form of like parliament essentially and things like that. Like Britain really did leave this sense of like the elite ruling class being very individualist, and so that's why Nkrumah talks about the problems of a lot of like African like doctors and other like nurses and other like relatively like elite educated people in the community leaving for like northern countries and things like that. So I think like we see how the sort of like I guess like one of the most like remaining sort of like ways that colonialism and like British rule has affected the African countries is through like making like this steep divide and like between like sort of like the masses and the public and like those who like try to rule, and I think like that has also been able to be seen in sort of like the corruption and the inability to make like an African Union even today, and how like those things are directly because of how sort of like scattered and separate countries.
Thank you so much for your time. Our time is up.
Thank you.